I'm Doug Osterman. I'm the Salmon Recovery Manager for the GreenDuwamish and Central Puget Sound watershed. And my presentation today is really about what has been happening over 20 years to recover Chinook salmon in this watershed and the collective impact that's gone into that and how you might be able to participate in the next 20 years. The GreenDuwamish watershed, from my vantage point, does include Vashon-Maury Island and most of King County's marine shoreline, including all of Elliott Bay, as well as the traditional watershed of the Green River, as it has been changed over time. It's about 650 square miles and one of the largest marine shoreline watersheds in Puget Sound. So even though I'm the Salmon Recovery Manager, I actually see myself, and I think this is important for the students in the room, as a fish and wildlife biologist. I kind of had in mind that I'd be tagging grizzly bears and monitoring their movements through the Rocky Mountains. But I ended up tagging elected officials and follow them across the countryside and try to get them all pointed in the same direction. This is the Watershed Ecosystem Forum. And it's a group that's been actually working together since 1998, so 20 years. Very dedicated elected officials, business representatives, and environmental interests across the table to develop a plan for the recovery of Chinook salmon in the GreenDuwamish and continue to work together as we adaptively manage that plan based on new science that we're always collecting. The watershed poster, which we brought 100 or so in the back at our display in the far left-hand corner. Please take one. It is representative of that 20-year, 50-year plan for the recovery of salmon in kind of a cartoon caricaturist way. It'll tell you the upshot of how and why we're doing what we're doing to recover salmon and address those 100 years of challenges that were created by replumbing the rivers and the growth and development that's occurred since. On the left is the recovery plan. It was developed from 1998, finished in 2005, ratified by every local government. All 17 local governments of the watershed ratified this plan in 2006, so they're all beholding to implement it. It was later rolled up into and as part of the overall Puget Sound Salmon Recovery Plan. That's the middle document. That's the plan guiding the recovery of Chinook salmon and integrates habitat, harvest, hatcheries, and dams into one Puget Sound approach or strategy for the recovery of Chinook salmon. And more recently, the plan, the federal plan, is rolled up into the action agenda of the Puget Sound Action Agenda, and the state agency, the Puget Sound Partnership, is the implementing organization. So RIA 9 is nested in this larger federal and state effort to recover salmon. We are in the process of updating the plan, and we sure hope you will participate. And at noon, we will have a little bit deeper dive opportunity for you to ask more questions and participate with us, including with some of the elected officials who have been participating in the update. The last couple of years, we've been analyzing new science that is going to inform the policy and the projects that we'll be identifying to do to recover salmon. And why are we doing this? Our abundance of Chinook salmon in this watershed are perilously low and continuing in that decline despite all these efforts that we've been doing. So it's really important that we re-up the effort, use science as well as we can to inform our public decision making, and start the process. But the downward slide, there's actually a red line in there that just shows from the 70s to today, our Chinook salmon population is plummeting. There are some huge opportunities though. Above Howard Hansen Dam, there's about 45% of the watershed and over 100 miles of river system that's perfect and former Chinook salmon habitat. So we're working to get fish passage above Howard Hansen Dam to help increase the area of spawning in the watershed. It's one of the major strategies. The other major strategy is to help baby fish survive in the watershed. We have actually pretty good spawning, but we lose a lot of the babies further down into the estuary. Our primary fish in the watershed is the fry, the small fish that use the estuary, and then par and smolts. The fry do not survive. Those baby fish come down into the Duwamish. There's not enough habitat, and there's other challenges. So our primary fish that's produced in the watershed, only 1% of them survive. We are working on their habitat needs. On the left is Duwamish Gardens project in the city of Tukwila, right in the Duwamish River where saltwater meets freshwater, and it's going to help those fry. And to increase the spawning, we also are doing projects in the Middle Green, not far from here at the Porter Levee, a major levee setback, and habitat restoration and floodplain reconnection project. Another reason we're updating the plan is we now know a lot more about climate change impacts and what it's going to do to the fish. And this graphic, which we have some in the back that you can look more closely at, but the bottom line is climate change is going to make the water hotter right at the time when these fish are in the watershed, those baby fish. So the impacts of flooding and warming temperatures and warming water are going to be a big challenge for us, and we need to figure out ways we can counteract that. Peak flows are going to increase throughout the watershed. Flooding's going to increase. We're already, in today's world, having sublethal and lethal water temperatures on the range of juvenile salmon that you saw the picture of earlier and the returning adult salmon that come into the river to spawn. Stream temperatures in general have increased. Over historic measures, you can see the amount of red that is today and projected in the future. That used to be a lot cooler water. So we're doing this habitat plan update. Again, I'd like to invite you to participate in it. We're actually considering today's meeting symposium as input. So if you've got some input and some suggestions for us, please do so. The process basically is we got a scientific assessment at the top, and then a policy and planning section and process at the bottom that includes public outreach. And in 2019, next year, we should be wrapping up a salmon habitat plan update and asking each of the 17 local governments to approve those changes. And that'll set the blueprint for the next 20 years. If you want more information, there's myself as well as several of my team members are here today. We have information about a public workshop that's coming up in Tukwila on March 27th. We'd love to have you participate. We'll do a little bit more deep dive into the science that I mentioned earlier. So it's a great opportunity to learn just exactly what is happening out there in the watershed right now from climate change and ecologically, and how we might be using that information to inform our public decision making. And interesting for me, as someone who's worked in this watershed since 1998, so for 20 years, actually 1995 is when I became a salmon or people recovery manager. Back in the 70s, there was a really interesting document done called The River of Green. And back then, in the 70s, which was quite a while ago, it stated someone should steadily be asking, is this the way we want it to be now and in the future? The ultimate condition of the Green River Basin should be the result of informed and far-sighted public decisions. We're still in that process, and thank you for participating in it. Thank you.
I have a little different perspective than Doug just shared. Rather than talking about accomplishments over the last 20 years, my presentation is going to be on an evolving discussion that's just started happening in the last 2 years, focused on the uplands and largely the National Forest and the Upper Green, and inviting you to get as excited as I am about an opportunity to really think about a restoration blueprint for those uplands that we'd implement over the next decade. So my name's Jen Watkins. I actually live just uphill from the Duwamish in South Seattle. This photo is Sawmill Creek. That was my first interaction with the uplands of the Upper Green, a beautiful place during a land conservation campaign I worked on in the early 2000s. And Forterra, who's here today, actually saw the conservation of this parcel. I have a different perspective of how we come to this common place than probably a lot of you in here. I'm a wildlife biologist and forester by training. And before I land in the watershed, we look at the whole region. And this is just the Cascades. And when I look at what I call the I-90 corridor, that's that world around Snoqualmie Pass on the east and west sides of the crest, I think about how wildlife have got to move from the North Cascades to the South Cascades. And that's everything from these amazing weasels, fishers, and martens that depend on the old growth forest. They live on the top of snags, to the elk that were brought up earlier, or the grizzly bears that we've got few in number of, but that Doug wanted to monitor and tag instead of politicians. And so when I think of this, the green and the upper green and the upper white lie within that I-90 corridor. The uplands of that are vital for wildlife if we think about how they move in the Cascades. And so regionally, when I take in that context, I know that this is a priority watershed for me. And only then when I step down into the watershed do I end up in symposiums like this, because there's nothing we can do in the watershed if I don't understand how it's connected to the larger plans, the aquatic and terrestrial needs, the cultural needs and social desires for what happens in this place as we begin to act. And so my focus, although it's just on that upper green portion and a lot of the green publicly owned land, we're interested in how that ties into a larger plan. And luckily, when you think about that upper portion of the watershed, in the last couple of years, the Mount Baker Snoqualmie National Forest, who owns quite a bit of that upper watershed, they've adopted a strategy. It's a restoration strategy that says when they think about managing their lands up there, they want to do it and manage those resources to restore and maintain and develop a resilient landscape. Those are great words in policy. They only matter if you understand the definitions of what resilient landscapes mean. That's that ability to absorb and interact with disturbances and recover from them. To increase an adaptive capacity means we know, as we heard earlier, climate change is going to make this worse in the future. So can you continue to absorb and recover from disturbances? But most importantly, when you hear that word restore, we have to define what we're restoring to, and what are we restoring for in a landscape. That became something I got pretty interested in the last couple of years as we think about the uplands. And a group of us from the University of Washington, state agencies, Nature Conservancy, myself, and some scientists started thinking, if we look at the Mount Baker Snoqualmie National Forest, the headlands to so much of Puget Sound, but also vital for wildlife as I described earlier, how do we think about defining restoration? And how can you inform a policy that wants to implement that? And as we look at all of that, for the reasons I explained earlier, we really focused on the southern parts, south of I-90 and the upper White and Green River watersheds. And so before you run all the fancy maps and models that exist out there, we thought about what are we restoring to. Part of it's to look at where we've been. So we started combing through the archives of historical photos to set a reference condition. What was this landscape like that we were trying to restore to? And before you even go through the archives, you've got Google Earth at you. So this was 84, 94, this is the upper White and Green together, 2004 and 2014. We looked at all of those photos to understand some things about context. How did the human communities grow? How did the habitat change out there? What are the patterns we're seeing? And some of the things that really emerged before you even just think about what you're restoring to in these two watersheds, many of you know in here, but it's been impacted heavily. And not just at one part of the watershed. From the headwaters at that Cascade crest on down, you see these patterns of disturbance and a heavy human imprint. And so when we think about just terrestrial need, that's for the wildlife, that's the trees that we're talking about. Before we get to the water and we define what are we restoring, what's actually wrong out there, we find that we don't have enough old forest. We don't have enough late successional forest on that habitat. That's the things those great weasels I mentioned earlier need to live, as well as spotted owls that provide many other functions. Not only do we not have enough of that, we don't have a shortage of clear cuts on that landscape, but they're not the complex early seral that used to happen after a fire. After last year, we've got a little bit more of that in the green, and it'll be interesting to see what happens. But we know that we not only don't have enough of it, it's not arranged correctly. So what we've got are little fragmented patches of that habitat, which isn't enough for wildlife, but it also just doesn't function for a whole host of services. Then many of you who know more about this than I, we have to define what do we mean by aquatic restoration? What are the impairments we really think we can fix? What are we restoring to? Roads never were part of this landscape. They are now. Floodplains, we are probably not going to get back to 100% function. But for thinking about the uplands, we need to think about in those subwatersheds, what are the ones that need active restoration? And many of you have that answer here, so I'm here to soak up that information. And then what would we do, and what are the impairments, and how much of it do we think we can fix? And then the second one that's so vital and important to me when you step into this watershed is while we do that in the uplands, How do those actions fit within a larger watershed restoration plan? Not only in concept, but in timing. As we take those actions, how will it meet the goals that people downstream have? And then finally, we also need to think about climate change. It's important and imperative throughout this landscape, not only for wildlife, it is a greater reason why they need to be on the move, but it exacerbates a lot of the things we're thinking about. And we worked with UW to start thinking about just from a human perspective. These two watersheds, the Upper White and the Upper Green, they pop out as areas where even the road system is more vulnerable because of the huge density and the location of roads in those uplands when we think about climate change. We're getting more landslides. We're shifting from a snow-dominated system to a rain-dominated system. So how do we bring that science to actually make a difference on the ground rather than just show you pretty maps? And the huge opportunity, other than these being discussions that I've worked on, that's happened is last year, the Mount Baker-Snoqualmie National Forest, led by Marty Schramm, if she's here today, actually began to ask the public, what do you see as the restoration need when you think about the Upper Green and the Upper White? They started a pre-NEPA process to ask that question and engage the public. And for everyone in here who has a dream of what you'd like to see happen in those uplands, that's a public engagement process that unfolds over the next year to start defining what actions you want to see. Unlike a lot of planning processes, those of you who work with the Forest Service, this is rare. They only look at a landscape every decade or so to ask that question and define a blueprint and actually take 10 years to implement that. So I offer to you, it's a huge opportunity to engage in the kind of science I've looked at, those that you already do, and dig into the restoration plans, to think about if you wanted to see actions in those uplands on national forest lands, what are they? How do they fit into the bigger picture? And how could we make that happen? Thank you.
Well, good morning, everybody. My name is Greg Volkart. I'm the Environmental Programs Manager for Tacoma Water. For over 100 years, Tacoma has used the Green River as its primary source of drinking water. I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about what we do up there, how we manage the municipal watershed, and some of the challenges we face. Tacoma Water is a division of Tacoma Public Utilities, and it was established about 125 years ago when the city purchased a private water system in order to better provide safe drinking water to the people of Tacoma. The Green River is our primary water source, as I mentioned, and we also have a number of well sources to provide backup and during peaking demand periods. We also have agreements or intertie capabilities to supply water to about 1 million people in South King County as well as Tacoma and Pierce County. Essentially, if you live south of SeaTac, we have the ability to provide water to you. Doug Osterman talked a bit about work on the Green River, and I think you've seen this map several times. It's essentially the sub-watershed map for the Green. I'm going to talk about the Upper Green River sub-watershed. When we talk about the municipal watershed, that's essentially what we're talking about is this area here. It extends from the crest of the Cascades and goes downstream to our Headworks Dam at about River Mile 61, which is about 3 miles downstream of that Army Corps of Engineers Howard Hansen Dam. The municipal watershed is 231 square miles. As Doug mentioned, the entire watershed is 650 square miles, so it's a large chunk of it. Each of the colors here represents a different landowner. Tacoma Water's lands are shown in yellow. We own a little over 16,000 acres, or about 11% of the watershed. Other major landowners include State DNR, which is shown in light blue, U.S. Forest Service in green. And then the other lands are owned, are industrial forest lands. They're owned by timber companies, investment organizations, and the Muckleshoot tribe. Managing a municipal watershed with such a diverse ownership can be challenging. However, in many cases, we've entered into cooperative agreements with the other landowners to ensure that their operations do not impact water quality that we need preserved. So kind of looking at our history, when the Green River supply was developed back in 1913, the utility's focus was largely on getting clean water to our customers. There was not much regard to the impacts of our operations on salmon. In fact, when the Headworks Dam was developed at that time, it precluded access to, I think Doug mentioned, about 100 miles of spawning habitat for Chinook salmon. Throughout the 20th century, much of our efforts were focused on acquiring lands in the watershed and improving our watershed control and security. However, as we've moved to the 21st century, the utilities' focus has broadened, recognizing that healthy ecosystems provide abundant, clear water. Investing in watershed health, sometimes referred to as natural capital, reduces filtration costs. Healthy ecosystems provide a variety of societal benefits, such as flood storage, refugia for fish and wildlife, carbon sequestration, old-growth forest preservation and development, and other benefits. You know, Josh mentioned a King County land conservation initiative to try and preserve the best lands. But nevertheless, growth is happening, and in an ever-growing and developing region, municipal watersheds, I believe, and not just Tacoma's, but all municipal watersheds, I believe will become increasingly important areas of ecosystem health on this landscape. So I'm going to talk about a few things that we are doing and some of the challenges that we're facing now. Tacoma Water developed a habitat conservation plan in 2001 to guide our operations in ways that are more beneficial to sensitive fish and wildlife species. Historic operations of the headworks diversion shown here had a large environmental impact on fish. The diversion was constructed in 1913 without fish passage. This presented, you know, as mentioned before, it prevented access to a large amount of habitat. In fact, we think it's about half the total amount of Chinook spawning habitat in the basin is upstream of Howard Hansen Dam. Wasteful water use practices coupled with abundant water rights held by the utility allowed for substantial dewatering of the river channel during summer low flows, particularly in dry years. These problems were corrected with our habitat conservation plan. Minimum in-stream flows to ensure adequate summer and early fall river flows were implemented as part of a settlement agreement with the Muckleshoot Indian tribe. That started in about 2006-2007 timeframe. And I think, Josh, when you look at your GreenDuwamish timeline, that might be a key one to add, because really it really allowed for better flows in the summertime that fish need. An adult fish trap and sort facility was constructed and became operational in 2007 in order to reintroduce salmon and steelhead into the upper watershed. And also a fish screen was installed along with a juvenile bypass at our headworks diversion dam in order to allow for safe downstream migration past the dam for juvenile fish and adult steelhead kelts. At that same time that the HCP was developed, Tacoma Water was working on a municipal water storage agreement with the Army Corps of Engineers behind Howard Hansen Dam. This agreement enabled water to be stored in the spring when snow melt and spring rains provided abundant flows to the river. And then this stored water could then be used in the summertime, not only for the citizens of Tacoma, but also it made a way for us to be able to guarantee those minimum in-stream flows that are required. A large focus of our work in the watershed has been on the restoration of fish habitat in order to pave way for the reintroduction of salmon and steelhead. Through these projects, over 1,300 logs have been installed in engineered log jams and loose wood placements to redress the past legacy of poor timber harvest practices and to improve habitat. You know, if you lined up those 1,300 logs, what does that mean? Well, if you lined them up end to end, it would essentially, you'd have a string of logs from here to Kent, the city of Kent. In addition to the fish projects, managing lands for protection of water quality really lines up well with protection of ecosystem services and wildlife habitats. Tacoma Water developed its forest management strategy in 1996 and dropped it into our HCP with very few changes. And it incorporates 3 management strategies depending on the sensitivity of the lands for impacts to water quality. The most sensitive lands are managed under a natural zone strategy, which means that they remain untouched. The Sawmill Creek slide that Jen showed you is a piece of land that's in our ownership now that we protect under the natural zone strategy. We also have a conservation strategy that we use to try and grow stands to reach old growth characteristics sooner by doing some selective thinning. Once those stands reach 100 years of age, they become no-touch. And then finally, about 25% of our lands are managed as commercial forest lands, but yet on a 70-year rotation, which is more typical rotation schedule is about 40 years in the Northwest. Along with conservative forest management, evaluation of forest roads and correcting fish blockages has been a big focus of ours. Over the last 15 years, we completed about 29 fish blockage corrections and opened up approximately 23 miles of habitat at a total cost of over $4.2 million. These costs are generally shared with other landowners that use the roads. And this just shows one of those corrections. The bridge is newly installed, and once it was installed, the next bit of work was to remove the old culvert and fill that you see there. So as we seek to restore ecosystem health in the municipal watershed, the biggest challenge we face is that salmon reintroduction has not yet occurred. As Doug mentioned, about 100 miles of Chinook habitat is located upstream. Some of the latest science is showing that providing access to this habitat could be the most important thing we do to restore salmon populations in the GreenDuwamish Basin. While the adult trap and sort facility at our Headworks Dam became operational in 2007, a downstream fish passage solution has not yet been created at Howard Hansen. And thank you very much.
And so I thought perhaps what I could share is a tool that we can use in the natural resource management sector to help give all of these strategies legs. It's relatively new for the Forest Service. We have a new conservation finance program under our umbrella of ecosystem services. And so I'll share how we're thinking about these tools for adaptive management, and I'll close with a couple of questions that I would love to pose to all of you about how might we take advantage of these tools from our diverse perspectives. So I'll start by defining conservation finance. How are we thinking about this in the Forest Service? And then, as I mentioned, brainstorming potential in this context. So at the core of conservation finance is acknowledging that environmental objectives, social objectives, and economic objectives don't have to be mutually exclusive. And I think in this environment that we're operating in right now, it's really nice to see synergies rather than operating in different boxes depending on our goals. There's a report that came out from Ecosystem Marketplace in 2016 that indicated that there's a huge potential of interest and investment in natural resource restoration projects. And there's a bit of a mismatch between the funds that are available and the readiness of those of us working in natural resource management to make the two connect. And so I'll speak a little bit about how we can enhance our ability to take advantage of this opportunity. So really at the basis of conservation finance and watershed investment is understanding the connections between forests and forested systems and those who benefit. So that might be a community, that might be a municipality, that might even be a private sector interest. And so the Forest Service is trying to help tell these stories through geospatial tools, ecosystem services evaluation exercises like this one. This is our Forest to Faucets project, where we show where are forests really important for surface drinking water and where are they threatened, and that can help to indicate and justify investments in restoration. There's a lot of talk right now about infrastructure. So built infrastructure, the American Water Works Association estimates that our built infrastructure for water needs about $1 trillion worth of investment over the next 25 years. So what immediately springs to mind is pipes and reservoirs. But how can we who care about watersheds reframe our infrastructure in terms of our green infrastructure? And that's a tremendous asset for the American public, and how can we both protect and restore it and invest funds in that direction? The Forest Service is also thinking about innovative ways that we can speak to our socioeconomic contributions to communities. So when one thinks about the Forest Service, timber and non-timber forest products often come to mind, but recreation is actually the greatest use of National Forest System lands, particularly on the Mount Baker Snoqualmie National Forest. And recreation makes a huge contribution to GDP. So how can we again make connections between sustaining these lands and recreation opportunities and socioeconomic contributions, so it's not only about timber production? As previous speakers alluded to, there's a growing body of literature about how access to nature and open space makes us healthier mentally and physically. So we can think about that in terms of our well-being and also as a public cost savings. There's social scientists who've been looking at connections between volunteerism and community cohesion. So these are some photos from the Duwamish Valley Youth Corps. How, through volunteerism, can we strengthen our connections to one another and also to the land? So these are just diverse pieces of a benefits puzzle that we can start to put together to build water funds. So just a couple of examples before I close. There are NGOs like the Nature Conservancy that help to assemble these different kinds of funds with the Forest Service, so this is an example in the Rio Grande watershed, and a collaborative group decides where do we need restoration, how can we be acting across boundaries to achieve our goals. In Flagstaff, Arizona, there was a bond measure passed where, following a campaign of greater understanding about connections between forest health and community health, people overwhelmingly voted to devote public funds to forest restoration, and that in turn attracted grants to a forest restoration project. A little closer to home in Eugene, Oregon, a more grassroots effort, the water utility tried to protect its floodplain through an ordinance and met a lot of pushback. So they chose instead to form a collaborative group with the Forest Service, land trusts, soil and water conservation districts, watershed councils, and we collectively built a payment for watershed services program where landowners with high quality riparian are given an incentive to protect those lands. Those who have degraded lands receive resources either in kind or in cash to restore those areas. And the Willamette National Forest is conducting stewardship contracting to protect the headwaters. So thinking big and across ownerships. It really helps, not that the business case is the only or the most important story, but being able to make a business case for investment can help our cause. So groups like Earth Economics and EcoTrust can assist us in doing some return on investment calculations for restoration. So in Eugene's case, we found that there's about a 260% return on investment over 20 years in directing monies to restoration rather than just continually restoring gray infrastructure. So that's a pretty powerful story. So thinking about the Green Duwamish, I really appreciate that Jen spoke about the Mount Baker Snoqualmie National Forest and the headwaters. As a Forest Service employee, I tend to have that bias, but I also work for state and private forestry in our research station and thinking about all lands approaches to watershed health. And I think there's tremendous potential in the Green Duwamish, and I really appreciate the opportunity to be here today. So there's already been a tremendous amount of work on ecosystem service valuation in this watershed. Capturing the numbers is less important than just an indication that this work has been done. So not that dollar signs are the most important story to tell in all cases. Cultural values cannot be assigned a monetary value. However, it's a tool. It's a tool in the toolbox to show what different land cover types provide to a municipality or a utility, or even a private sector interest that has a corporate social responsibility mission. What can this mean for them? So, as Jen and others have mentioned, there's also been tremendous work on restoration strategy development. On the right is a map of the Mount Baker Snoqualmie National Forest, but this is occurring across the watershed. So if we can pair that great restoration planning with an understanding of the natural capital and the benefits that will be provided to diverse constituents from that restoration, we can actually bring funds to the table to implement this work. So just in closing, a few questions that we can consider and I would like to learn more about here. What are some challenges that you're facing or you perceive in the watershed? And are there specific challenges where forest restoration can make a difference? So how can we be explicit about those outcomes, cause and effect relationships to make the case for investment? And then finally, what can we accomplish by working collectively that the National Forest cannot do alone or the City of Tacoma cannot do alone? What can we do together? That notion of collective action that we heard about earlier. So with that, thanks for your attention. I look forward to the discussion.
Excellent. Thanks, Nicolette. All right, we're gonna take some questions here with Rain. Can I also ask that the next panel please come up to the corner over here, the front audience right, and so that you're queued up and ready to go? All right, Rain, go ahead.
Okay, I have 2 questions here, but I hope that people are writing down additional ones for each of the panelists. So, Doug, this question is directed at you regarding water temperatures. Are there any methods other than reforestation that WIRA 9 wants to see implemented to reduce water temperatures? And maybe that could be incorporated into the Chinook restoration plan?
Our primary strategy as it exists. Is that because there's 2 of them on? Turn that.
Oh, sorry.
Our primary strategy right now is Josh Baldy pointed it out in his presentation, is Regreen the Green. And that is, Regreen the Green is based on science that showed that the Department of Ecology and the EPA did, that shows that temperature is a big water pollutant, basically, of the GreenDuwamish. And with the help of the Muckleshoot tribe, we've identified the areas of the greatest solar radiation and heating of the river. And so the green strategy is really where we need to plant trees and big trees to maximize the cooling of the river as it exists today. And basically this map shows from the upper green down through the Duwamish where if you're going to plant a tree and a big conifer, where are you most strategic to plant it? So shading is a major strategy. Other things that help with water temperatures is good surface water management and sending, I think Dr. Monica said it really well, doing things like the series of wetlands and bioretention ponds and slowing that water down and having more water go into the groundwater is a definite strategy for Chinook recovery as well. So that's one area where we're integrating and getting that collective input of the technologies of surface water management with fish management.
And a follow-up question to that, Doug, what about beaver dams?
What about beaver dams? Beaver dams a big issue in the green is lack of wood. So Greg mentioned 1,300 miles of 1,300 logs stretching several hundred miles. And that's only a portion of what's needed in the watershed. So to the extent that beavers can help accomplish getting more wood in the water, beavers are a good thing.
Okay, thank you. Jen, this question is directed at you regarding restoration consideration and the scope of it. How do you think the scope of your historical consideration to only archival photos in Google Earth limited your concept of what to restore to? So where are the local tribal governments in this process for consideration of that vision?
It's a great question. One, I would say we were very limited in how we were defining a reference term. We were trying to use not only historical photos, but records that we could find in written documents about what those patterns were. So we were limited in that when we thought about Western Washington. A second limit is, in Western Washington, when we had fires over here, they were huge. So when you pick a point in time to restore to, it's pretty biased about how you want to actually think about that when we talk about scale. And scale matters in defining terrestrial restoration because we could be thinking about the whole West Cascades when fires burned tens of thousands of acres all in one time. And they were big impacts on this side of the state versus scales when we try to implement in a watershed. So just technically of looking at photos and science and our own reference conditions, we recognized there was a limitation. We just wanted to start somewhere to ground ourselves in a place of what did it mean to restore to. Did we bring in local knowledge yet? Absolutely not. And I hope there's not only a place for that in our efforts, but as you think about the Forest Service and how they begin to define these reference conditions in policy and practice for planning, I think there's a huge place for that.
Thank you. Greg or Nicola, maybe both of you can answer this question, give your perspective regarding climate change and increased fire risk in the watershed. So how can we drive more money to forestry management to help mitigate the increased fire risk to our water sources, like for city of Tacoma up there in the uplands and headlands?
Well, fire risk is something that we're pretty concerned about. And last year we had a kind of a significant fire very close to that Sawmill Creek area that you saw that beautiful photograph in Jen's presentation of the old growth trees there. Thankfully it didn't reach those stands, but we're very concerned about fire risk. What we see is fires coming from a couple sources. One is obviously lightning strikes. Another one is just the hand of man being careless out in the woods. And so the municipal watershed, a large part of it is closed to the public, which helps limit that second way for fire to happen. But our watershed inspectors work 7 days a week patrolling up in the watershed to try and pay attention to where lightning strikes occur, go check them out, try and ensure that we can prevent fires once started from happening. In terms of climate change, what we need to do and what we're trying to do is really try and maintain good forest health. And we're doing that again by trying to be very conservative and selective about areas that we do harvest timber on, with the idea of trying to keep as much of our watershed lands into a protected class that, where we have good forest cover, and then being diligent about things like lightning strikes and whatnot to make sure we're investigating those quickly.
Did you want to move on to another question?
Yeah. Unless you'd like to take a stab at it. Okay. Thank you. I have two other questions I'd like to get in before time expires. One is around diversity and equity, and one is around tools and technology. So, to Doug about diversity and equity, how do we incorporate more diverse backgrounds and views and people into the decision-making panels?
That is an excellent question. What we have been, by virtue of the group that I work with all the jurisdictions that are involved, and Josh again showed a really good map that shows where the diversity and the equity needs are in the watershed. Those happen to overlap almost one for one with where the major restoration needs to occur. So if you overlay open space with salmon restoration, with where communities are in need in this watershed, there's a huge overlap. So collectively, if we were to implement the Salmon Habitat Plan, which is local governments working at the community level with their residents, we will be bringing a significant amount of improved conditions within neighborhoods, both in terms of the open space that's good for health and recreation, for recovering Chinook salmon, which has cultural and tribal and people implications. So if you are going to try to implement something in a watershed that has equity and social justice and environmental justice need, this is the watershed to do it. So you have to work with everybody. And I think specifically, we can do a better job of outreaching to those communities to figure out, you know, and integrate them and bring them into the fold and into the conversation.
Well, it seems like there's many organizations here today that you should tap into, and they should tap into you, right?
Yes, please.
Okay. This question is for anybody who would like to answer the question around tools and technology. What efforts are being taken to make stakeholder data, such as mapping and GIS, more open and connected? And how can we cultivate a healthier open data ecology across stakeholders for better collaboration and better process and better end products, so to say?
I seem to be nominated by the panel to answer this question. It's a really good point. We within the Forest Service, I work with folks particularly in our watershed program based in our Washington, D.C. headquarters about, there's a conundrum of so much more data that we'd love to collect coupled with declining budgets and capacity concerns. So we're trying to understand how can we better connect our existing databases, some of the GIS analysis that I mentioned, both within our organization so we can articulate not just the acres that we're thinning or the board feet that we're producing, but also looking at tangible socioeconomic benefits to communities in a way that's consistent across the Forest Service, but also consistent with our partners. So the Forest to Faucets map that I showed is a GIS exercise that's all ownerships so that the GIS layers can be used by any organization. I think it's really pertinent that we have consistent databases and ways of collecting information across sectors. Any other responses from the group?
So just from being in a nonprofit stance, one of the things that's difficult is to get access to a lot of the data that the jurisdictions and the land managers have, and a frustration that at times where we think there's a data gap, we find ourselves doing redundancy and creating data that already existed somewhere. And then the final part is we make all these efforts and maps, and the data grows old because no one had access to it, or things have changed within a year when we saw it. And so there's a pretty exciting effort that was born out of the landscape conservation cooperatives, the big efforts to address climate in the US and our neighboring countries. Here in Cascadia, that's trying to figure out how do we put this data all in one place that we have access to better. And granted, yes, there will always be locked layers when there's a listed species somewhere and occurrence data we can't have. But one place is for people who, it's kind of like using Excel for dummies. There's a place called Databasin where anybody who doesn't even know GIS can get in and use the layers. And there's a new gallery that's been put up for Cascadia that tries to put in not only the fish survey data, but the land management data of what are the different allocations that are out there, what's the latest climate science, and kind of this endless repository where you can drill down and look at a place. And just for new and innovative things that are coming, Google actually, that can sound terrifying or exciting to you, is looking at this landscape to figure out if you need to be able to look at that in real time because these landscapes are constantly changing at us, how can we have those databases speak to Google Earth? And so you could literally just go in and look here and be able to look at not only fish survey information or the most important wildlife corridor or where that last late successional forest is, but you're seeing that satellite imagery for places that burned just last year before we've updated our layers. So I would say for this area, there's some really exciting things. And one last one of how do we create data layers, I think sometimes we don't see our cultural or social values represented in data. And the Mount Baker Snoqualmie has done a brilliant job of trying to figure out when talking recreation, how do we mark our favorite places and have that represented in a data layer so you can compare it in the same way that you're analyzing other things. And that's a cutting edge of bringing social science into a way we can analyze that I think is happening here in this watershed in a really cool way.
Okay, thank you. So, as always, we have more questions than can be addressed in a short time period. So if you submitted a question for this panel and it was not asked, please take the opportunity to follow up with the presenters during the day.